Hello, everyone. I hope you are having a good Sunday evening. Um, I want to talk to you guys about how people point to certain things to justify evil actions, evil policies, evil ideas. This may be a long video, I don't know. Depends on how I can communicate my message to you guys. Sometimes my mind is a little slow. Sometimes my mind is very fluid and smooth. And at times my mind is as cold as a car motor that needs antifreeze. It kind of sucks making videos sometimes because of that reason. Some people are really, really good at doing videos. I don't really have that talent. But nonetheless, I'm going to go on anyway because I have some ideas for you, ideas which I have been pontificating on and pondering on. They are two recent modern historical examples of what I am talking about. One is the American creation of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And the second is the American and German creation of the KLA, or the Kosovo Liberation Army. So when the Americans created the Mujahideen, they did so with a dual purpose. For one, they wanted to flood Afghanistan with mujahids, or Islamic fighters, in order to provoke the Russians into invading Afghanistan. And by provoking the Russians to invade Afghanistan, they would then say, we have our reason to devastate the Russians. And that was the second reason for backing the Mujahideen. It was to cripple the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the second pole of power at that time. They were two poles of power. I'm pretty sure you know the other one, the American Empire, and then there was the Soviet Union. Once you had the fall of the Soviet Union, the American Empire began to expand, and the expansion of the American Empire was very much so accelerated by the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's not forget that not too long after the fall of the Soviet Union, you had the first Gulf War. You also had the NATO destruction of Yugoslavia. And then in the early 2000s, you had the invasion of Iraq, really the invasion and utter destruction of Iraq. And then you had American intervention into Libya and into Syria. These policies would have been very difficult to fully accomplish if the Soviet Union was still intact. But because the Soviet Union was absent, the American Empire was enabled, essentially, to do what it wanted. So let's go back to Afghanistan. The Mujahideen was facilitated and it was enabled to inundate itself within Afghanistan. And the presence of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan greatly concerned the Russians, and the Russians were provoked into invading that country. And then that gave the Americans the green light to exasperate the situation even more. And it gave the Americans the chance to say, oh, look at these evil Russians, they're invading these poor Afghans. And then let's fast forward into the 1990s. Germany and the United States essentially created the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army. And the KLA were a mixed bag. They weren't exactly your puritanical Islamic fundamentalists. These weren't exactly a bunch of guys walking around with henna in their beards. A lot of these guys were drug dealers. A lot of these guys were pimps and narco traffickers. These weren't exactly the type of guys you would see in the mosque on Friday to, do the prayer in the middle of the dawn, right in the crack of dawn in the earliest part of the morning. A lot of these guys were the types of people you would see in a nightclub somewhere in, Sarajevo or somewhere in the Balkans, to make sure that their property is serving the clients correctly, which is just a way of saying, well, it's part of the whole, pimp logic thing of seeing prostitutes as property. That's the type of guys these were. These were the types of guys who would have prostitutes, they would have drugs, They would kidnap people for their organs. I'm not joking. Like, kidnapping people, dissecting them, taking their organs, and then selling them in the black market. I know, sounds like a complete conspiracy theory, sounds like a bunch of horse crap, but it's real. There was a whole investigation that was done by the European Union. Well, it wasn't exactly whole because it was prevented from being completed, but what the investigation found before it was ceased was that there was indeed this sort of atrocity taking place, and it wasn't just a few cases here and there. It was immense. It was very, very frequently done, to put it mildly. These were some very, very demonic people. And then, of course, you had a lot of Islamic fundamentalists that were involved in the KLA. In fact, they were Afghan mujahideen involved in the KLA, thus bridging two American policies, bridging America's policy in Afghanistan with America's policy in Yugoslavia. The two connected. They went full circle. They bridged together. The two policies coincide because they both are rooted in American expansionism and a lot of the destructive policies that go along with that. And I'm not saying that America shouldn't have an empire, because I know that if the American empire declines, which it kind of is, although it's being done by America's own doing, I know that if that were to take place, you would have much worse empires that would fill in the vacuum. You would have Japan, Turkey, you would have Germany, far, far more scary than the United States. But that's not to say that America is just a bunch of innocent people, or America is completely saintly. America has done some very atrocious things. But those are just two examples of what I'm talking about. And you have a lot of people who utilize this sort of reasoning. They say, well, look, the Russians are in Afghanistan. Oh, let's further back the Mujahideen. Oh, look, the KLA, right? The KLA was created by the United States and Germany. It was a NATO creation. The KLA began to kill Serbian civilians. The Serbs reacted and began to kill Albanians. Many of the times, the Serbs would just kill terrorists, although there were abuses that were done by the Serbs. The Serbs weren't completely innocent either. But nonetheless, the Serbs had a reaction. That reaction was presented by the American press as, oh, look at these evil Serbs murdering these innocent Albanians, and the Americans got the green light to do what it wanted in furthering the utter destruction, fragmentation of Yugoslavia. In fact, there were several members of the KLA who would later admit this, that they killed Serbs, that they attacked Serbs for the deliberate purpose, for the wanton purpose of getting the Serbs to react, to provoke the Serbs to react. What was going on in this context? What was going on in this situation? It was a strategy of tension. It was doing certain things in order to get a reaction, and through that reaction you have tension between two sides. And when you have tension between two sides, both sides can be manipulated by outside forces that are a lot more organized and a lot more intelligent, a lot more wealthy. The CIA did this with the Bosnians. They told the Bosnians, oh, look, the Serbs want to do a genocide on the Bosnian people. That was a lie. It was a strategy of tension. Once you understand the existence of the SOT, the strategy of tension, then you can understand pretty much everything about politics. Pretty much everything about politics is founded, or it is rooted on the SOT, the strategy of tension. Republican versus Democrat, strategy of tension. Getting Republicans terrified of the Democrats enough to get American voters to vote for who the Republican Party wants to win. Strategy of tension. Getting the Democrats so angry that you get the Democrats to vote for whoever the Democrat Party wants to win. It's part of the strategy of tension. Get both sides angry, fearful, paranoid, filled with anxiety, hysterical, in order to manipulate both sides to get them to vote and to accept what you want them to accept. It is a form of desensitization that is very, very effective. Very effective. And it's very scary. Look at this whole Rayshard Brooks thing. George Floyd. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. But then you find out, well, wait a second, George Floyd stole a pack of cigarettes. Wait a second, George Floyd had a pretty nasty criminal past. Why are we celebrating this man? Why are we glorifying this man like as though he was some sort of a martyr? And then you have the fact that this police officer put his knee on George Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes. Was it necessary? Probably not. The guy was on his stomach. He had the handcuffs on. His hands were behind his back. Wasn't necessary. But what you find in that George Floyd story is enough information for both sides to justify their positions. The Democrats can say, or the leftists, the progressives, the anarchists, whatever you want to call them, the left wing, let's just call them lefties for the sake of expediting communication. Let's just say lefties. The lefties can say, well, the man had his neck, the officer had his neck on George Floyd's, his neck. The officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. That was not necessary. The man was screaming, I can't breathe. Mama, help me. And then he dies. That's enough to get a lot of people angry, and understandably so. I mean, you look at the video, it looks pretty horrific. But then, of course, you have to look at other details, and that's when the other side comes along, the conservatives, the right-wingers. The righties come along and they say, wait a second now. There was an autopsy. Autopsy said that he didn't die from suffocation. What's going on here? Wait a second. He had meth in his blood. Maybe that contributed to it. Wait a second. He stole a pack of cigarettes. He did not comply with the police. There's video footage showing that he didn't comply, that he was resisting arrest. What happened here? Then the righties have their argument and they have their position. And what happens? The lefties, they begin to provoke rioting. You have riots. What happens? The other side gets angry. The other side gets angry. And the other side says, wait a second, there's riots taking place. And you're rioting about a man who was a criminal. And the conclusion of this story, the conclusion of what really happened in the George Floyd story, has not reached its conclusion yet. We haven't even had a trial for Officer Chauvin yet. So why are we rioting? There's enough information for both sides to get angry. Now, there was another case that didn't get as much attention as the George Floyd story. There was the case of this girl named Breonna, and I'm pretty sure all of you guys have heard this story. Breonna was sleeping in the bed with her boyfriend one night, and a bunch of cops bust open her door. They don't have police uniforms on. Boyfriend gets up and he sees a bunch of men in his home. And I think they lived in an apartment. You know, he sees a bunch of men in his apartment. What do you think he's gonna do? He takes his gun out and he shoots. And the cops open fire and they kill his girlfriend. They killed his girlfriend. They shot his girlfriend. They shot Breonna 9 times. Was this justified? No. Is there any sort of excuse for these officers? No. These officers, for one thing, weren't dressed in uniform. They were dressed up as civilians. They got the wrong home. They got the wrong place. Now, they say that Breonna's address was connected to a criminal that they were looking for, because it turns out that Breonna had a past relationship with, I believe, a drug dealer or some sort of a criminal. So they were looking for this guy. Breonna's address was in a list of addresses as part of the authorities' investigation. They went to this place. But the problem is that Breonna wasn't doing anything illegal. Her boyfriend wasn't doing anything illegal. They break into the house. They don't have officers' uniforms on. They don't have uniforms. They're dressed up as civilians. So for all this guy knows, for all the boyfriend knows, these guys could have been some kind of Charlie Manson cult. He wasn't going to take any risks. Of course, you can't blame the guy for taking his gun and firing at these guys. Officers kill his girlfriend. Now, there was some attention on the Breonna story, but it didn't get nowhere near as much as the George Floyd story, and still nowhere near as much as the Rayshard Brooks story, the Wendy's story. Why? It's amazing. The Breonna story, you have a cold-cut case of an abuse done by officers. You have a cold-cut case of an innocent person being killed by cops, wrongfully killed by cops. You have a clear-cut case of a story that should not have happened. But yet you put more emphasis on the Rayshard Brooks story and on the George Floyd story. And I believe, this is my suspicion, not saying this emphatically, I believe that the reason why they don't put as much emphasis on the Breonna story is because in the Breonna story, everyone agrees. Conservatives will agree that what happened to Breonna was wrong. There is no other information that righties can take to make an argument against the left or the anti-police crowd. There's no argument to be there. When you have information that is enough for both sides to use against each other, it muddies the water. It leaves enough gray area so that both sides can begin to be aggressive towards one another. But with the Breonna story, there's no room for a strategy of tension. The liberals can get mad, the lefties can get mad, and the righties can get mad. They can both express anger about what happened to Breonna. In other words, there is no strategy of tension because where there is unanimous agreement, there is no tension. It's just that simple. So, once you understand the reality of a strategy of tension, and go Google strategy of tension when you get a chance. Google it. It's a real term. It's not something that I've made up. It's an actual term that came from Italian intelligence. It was later incorporated into NATO intelligence, and it was really the foundation for the Gladio operations. Look it up. Once you understand the reality of strategy of tension, then you understand politics. Bottom line. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.